Hello, everyone. This is Andy Kriebel. I am the head coach at the Information Lab Data School in London, and happy to have today here with me Carl Allchin, who is also a coach here. I'll let him introduce himself in a second. But today he's going to talk to us. He's been involved in self-service BI for quite a while now, and we asked him to come talk to us about the things that make self-service successful. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Carl.
Cool. Thank you, Andy. Yes, Eva and Andy gave me an absolute stonking title, which is quite the tongue twister. So I'll just say the 5 key ingredients for now, but know that it's with self-service.
And before Carl gets started, I meant to mention that if you have any questions or comments, you can leave them on the right-hand side of your screen. And if you could leave your name as well, that would be useful because then we can address you by name.
Cool.
Okay.
All right. So as Andy mentioned, I actually work with Andy at the data school in the UK. So we recently doubled the cohorts, mostly due to a real strong desire to get a lot more people to go and support organizations moving towards more and more self-service. And that's really one of the things that has worked well at the data school. But I've also seen the other side of that, shall we say, where self-service wasn't kicking around in all organizations and caused a lot of pain. So I'll go into my history a little bit more in a bit. But for now, let's kick on and actually say the first thing, which is why we're even talking about self-service. So for me, we can't ignore the rise of data any longer. It's this thing that has kind of loomed over us more and more. Ultimately, the Economist headline that's been very much overused in presentations. So I thought I'd use it one more time. This idea that data is the new oil. Basically, what they're trying to say is data has a huge value, whether it's as large as oil or not, doesn't overly matter. But ultimately, it's playing more and more of a part in everyday corporate life. And also, there's a huge value behind it. So we need to start caring about it. Because really, when I first started working in corporate organizations, data was just kind of about the guys sitting over in the corner of the office. Everybody kind of ignored them. They might use some of their reports, but it was very much just to validate their own thoughts, rather than actually data having that value in the organization and us trying to extract the value from that. You know, over time, I've seen more and more people asking questions with data, trying to get data at their fingertips to answer those questions. So it wasn't just about those few guys sitting in the corner of the office. It became more pertinent, but people didn't really have the skills to do it. And I think I'm seeing more pressure now in terms of organizations feeling from newer members of staff, younger members of staff who are coming out of universities and expecting to have access to the types of tools that we're kind of used to, that, you know, Andy talks about in terms of Tableau, Eva in terms of Excel and databases. People are expecting kind of tools to be able to grow with them and no longer just kind of holding things in just the domain of IT. Again, more on that in a little bit.
So quick question before you move on there, Carl, on that slide. So you have the term BI on there. Actually, I think that's a very misused term as well. So, you know, BI, from what I think of, is, you know, traditional reporting with, whatever tools, you know, even Excel or MicroStrategy or things that are built for really, really robust reporting. And I think what's important there is the intelligence part, like you mentioned there. And I think that's kind of where the I, to me, doesn't really mean intelligence, it means insights. So I think that's an important thing with self-service, is business intelligence or business insights, as well as that insights part of it.
Yeah, for me, I is still about the intelligence part, and mostly because we are all intelligent. I like to think we are. I know a few people challenge me on that continually, but that's just mostly my dad. But ultimately, I think the R word you used was really important, Andy. It's the reporting words, that those are the days that are dead. So moving more from just, I get the same numbers every week and we wonder why people don't use those reports, it's not surprising. It's not letting people go and find any new insights, use their intelligence to go and work with data. People can only leverage those reports for so long before, well, I know the answer to that and I want to go and ask the next question. And I think it's that reporting idea that is the piece that has died. And also with the death of that reporting, because that used to be done centrally, I think that's really where the pressure for more self-service coming from as well. There's kind of everybody in the business kind of wants to be able to go and do this thing because they're intelligent, they want to ask questions and they can ask questions, so they should be. But we're still kind of stuck where data is that kind of sticky point that they can't use their intelligence, can't dig into those insights because the tools aren't quite there, or they've not been released or unshackled is a word I'll use later to let them play with that further. But whether that's insights, the thing that comes after us using our intelligence, not sure which one our BI should be.
Okay. Quick question. I saw a comment on the webinar here that whoever it is, they can't hear the presentation. If somebody else can hear, can you please just leave a comment that says, yes, you can hear? Because that would be helpful for us to know if we need to address the issue or not. So we'll just pause for a second while somebody hopefully replies. And I guess if you hear the question, then the answer is yes, but it'd be good to see a comment in there. Okay. So I don't know if that means nobody can hear or everybody can hear. Can somebody leave a comment, please? Okay, nobody's going to leave a comment, so let's just move on.
All right, cool. So that was why self-service.
Okay, somebody said they can hear. Okay, thank you.
Cool, thank you for the response. So that was why the importance of self-service, and hopefully that rings true for you, hence why you're dialing into the call to actually to hear us kind of discuss it and why it is as important as it is. So ultimately, let me tell you a bit more about my story. So as Andy mentioned, I'm Allchin. My official title is the Assistant Head Coach at the Data School in the UK. So that's working alongside Andy and teaching, hopefully, that next set of gurus in terms of Alteryx and Tableau and other tools, and just basically data knowledge and ability to use data. So after they have 4 months training with us, they go out into the big wide world and go and work with a whole load of our clients across a range of industries. And that range of industries literally covers everything. That's why there's so much demand to do more of this. And it's that kind of desire to go and create new talent that's really the thing that gets me out of bed every morning, because I know how problematic this is as a challenge to really go and enable that self-service. And ultimately, I lived through it. So I'm a history and politics student by trade, even though I now purely work in data and technology. And my first real corporate role was at Aviva, the insurer. I came into that team early. I worked in a team called Ops Development, which doesn't really describe what it actually is. Really what that team was doing was synthesizing reports from other teams that would send through individual charts or numbers that summarized what was going on within their business unit. So the Ops Development team could go and take those numbers or those individual charts and send them as a wider PowerPoint deck to the executive to help the executive understand really quickly what was going on within the business. But when I started to trace back where those reports came from, those numbers, it was the guys sitting in the corner of the office, that these guys would take extracts from the IT teams as they couldn't code in SQL directly themselves. They'd go and use Excel to build those charts, build those insights out, put those charts into a PowerPoint packs and send them across to their operational heads. But ultimately, those operational heads would dispute some of the numbers. If it showed something in a bad light, you would get a bit of back and forth. And then ultimately, those numbers the ones that were supported, would go through to then go and be raised to the exec. So really, that context was lost at lots of different stages, even before it got into that reporting team in the first place, with taking the data out of SQL and putting it into that. And I should know this because I actually ended up running that MI team, the Management Information Team. That's ultimately what my job was for 3.5 years. And really my challenge there was to get the guys to stop just turning the handle on the reporting, just to kind of do this manual processing of reports, and see if we could get them working on something more insightful and more intelligent. And that's originally where I came across Tableau as one of the tools to do that. I tried out quite a few, and all of them had a lot more power than what we could just do within Excel. But really it was that, how can I get my guys and my team to really start working in a cleverer way? But it was the final piece was really adding visual analytics into this mix to really help the guys move on even further, and also help the stakeholders understand what was coming through. That yes, they only have so much time to really understand the piece of analytics. And if that's insightful and we have to take a few minutes to walk through it, that can't happen if they've got to assess what's going on across the whole business. By just using a few data visualizations, actually we created a much better conversation, much better context as to what was going on within the teams. And that's why I really then kicked on in my next stage of my career at Barclays, where I just got more involved in Tableau, more involved in data visualization and teaching off the back of that. And then subsequently, after my time at Barclays, when I was working right across the business, so again, everybody trying to benefit from more analytics, wasn't necessarily fully self-serve. But the information lab itself, which runs the data school, I had 4 years as a consultant there, or here as I should say, really going and taking my Barclays work and spreading it further across lots of industries, but also trying to support industries and companies to do this work themselves, really creating self-service analytics for the first time, because it's really powering a few kind of key elements, my 5 key ingredients, really became the kind of powerful bit that if you can get these things in place, and it's almost as an evolution that it really works. So let's actually go and dig into those 5 things. And the first one's a big one. And if you're kind of sitting here just at the start of your data analytics journey, this one probably feels familiar. If you've worked in data for years, you'll probably look at this one and think, well, that's pretty obvious. But not everybody gets it, and not everybody has really kind of spent the time that they need to really get to know their data. Because let's look at some of the trappings that you get if you don't spend your time with your data and getting to know it. Self-service won't happen without it, because if you don't know what your data is like, then how can anybody else? And I often feel like organizations nowadays are pressing forth to go and work with artificial intelligence or machine learning without doing some of the core fundamental work to really understand what their data is showing. You know, data often isn't trusted in situations where we're not clear on what it means because data's been misused. Again, I'd hark back to some of the kind of centralized reporting that used to take years to go and create. Well, felt like years to go and create. Certainly existed for years, but would take weeks or months to create. So it's a very distant past of what it was actually reflecting and the older business questions rather than our current needs. And also data is not trusted by those who don't use it because of what we see around us in the media every day. Breaches, misuse, spying on the consumer. There's a lot of mistrust as to what actually happens and what exists out there. So getting to know your data is around familiarization with data and working with data more. Not necessarily everybody across the organization to begin with, but just spending that little bit more time can help massively. I was at a talk in Dublin just last week actually, and one of the speakers from KPMG highlighted a really interesting point around 52% of an organization's data is called dark data. Like, first of all, it sounds fun, sounds Batman-esque, so, you know, someone's going to go and do something crazy with this stuff. But really what the theory behind dark data is, if I use the Wikipedia's description or kind of explanation of the ability of an organization to collect data can exceed the throughput at which it can analyze it. What that basically means in English and human language is we've collected a whole load of data. IT teams have been great at that for years. What we've not been great at is actually opening that up to users to go and add their business expertise, their context onto that data to actually make sense of what it's showing. So that's why data's suddenly gone dark and we have so much of this stuff. Like, ultimately, if we can't really add that context as it's come in, it will lose relevance really quickly. Not to say it's not really useful. Lots of my role at Barclays was digging into what was perceived as this dark data, though it wasn't called that at the time, to make a lot more sense of it as we went through.
So how does that then relate to, so you need to get the basically 52% of the data is never touched, is kind of what that means. So that kind of comes back to the reporting versus, you know, analyzing or intelligence part of it, right? So you're reporting on some of the data, but because you're doing reporting that most people probably don't use anyway, you don't have the time then to do the intelligence part, which could be where the golden nuggets are for, you know, finding new revenue or finding, you know, corruption or whatever it might be.
Yeah, it comes down to having access to that data, having the skills to be able to go and work with that data, having the right tools to work with that data. I've had many disagreements with senior people in organizations across the years where they're worried about what happens when you kind of open up data to lots of different people across the organization. And I think the more scary thing is, well, what happens if you don't? And now this kind of concept of dark data is coming out more and more. I feel like that's validating my argument. Maybe I'm being biased with that, but it's that idea that it's kind of being restrictive, to say the least, with what the actual possibilities could be. And also just how we're even storing that data as we collect it. SQL with its underscored names, etc. And if you're attached to something as a project, but you don't have that business context, we get unclear column names, poorly structured tables, maybe over aggregated just to kind of save on space, or something that can be over filtered, which then loses that context even more. Yes, reporting cuts out a huge amount of the context to let us play with that, but also maybe sometimes the way that we're holding data does as well. So what do we ultimately need to go and learn how to kind of know our data? Well, one is breaking that reporting cycle. Let people go and interact with that structured, clean data and make it available. You might not always know the why they need to have it, but actually if you change that question of why do you need to have something to why can I not give it to you, that becomes really powerful. Like I feel that's one thing that we do pretty well at the Information Lab is we make lots of data sets available. We don't necessarily always know why, but we certainly lead with a question of why not. We don't share all of our salary information with each other, but we do share all of our sales information and who spent what on expenses, because maybe we find a way to actually go and optimize that. We haven't worked out that that's absolutely what we want to do, but if we make that data available, then somebody might think about it and come up with a solution that we don't even know what's possible. I'm sure you've had the time in corporate experience where you have to justify everything for a project. And that project spend has to be justified, so you have to be really clever around actually saying, well, this is absolutely what I'm going to get out of this data. That really restricts innovation, let alone getting the chance to work with that data and know it first of all. It's only because some of my stakeholders in former companies basically gave me some play space and some play time that I actually really got involved in this and the chance to kind of go and play with it even more.
So how do you think organizations should go about giving people that play time, right? Because that's often when people are going to explore the questions that they've always had, or they start analyzing the data kind of free form, and they find they might run down a hypothesis or something, and it might not go anywhere, which is part of the analytical process as well. So what are some of your recommendations for companies to actually free up their employees to do more of that exploratory analysis?
Yeah, I think it's exactly that, creating that time to let them have that play. I think every organization, if you sit in the kind of what do you want to achieve this year, most of them will say, I want to be more innovative. I want to go and play. I'm happy that people fail. Just fail fast, fail quickly. But then we write down these really clear objectives that we have to meet, so they give us no space to actually go and play and fail. So I think it's a change in that kind of corporate targeting a little bit.
So it comes from the leadership then?
It absolutely has to come from the leadership.
Or even your own personal manager, right? Your own manager could say, you know what, I want you, I know you enjoy this type of work. Let me give you even an hour a week, something like that.
But it should be for everybody. So even my mum as a branch employee at Barclays for years, she was given 15 minutes every quarter to look at a big pack of data to find something that will help improve the branch. An absolutely impossible task with the wad of paper that she was actually given. But she was still given some time. So if we're giving time for those kind of exercises, and I think that's built into quite a lot of jobs, if we can have that more as free time and exploratory time, then that becomes really interesting. I think it's also how do we empower some of those elements? There's lots of the kind of structures of data and tools that we get to play with within corporates are often dictated by central teams, because you want to kind of have that consistent tool that you use across the organization. And I'm not against that. That's often set up by, in my experience, data architects, but those data architects are very cut off from those business users, seeing how that they want to work with data and how possibly could they work with data. So really what I'm campaigning for and would massively support is to get the data architects to really go and kind of ask what, when, how, where, and why. Like, what are users trying to achieve? When do they need data? When does it need to be refreshed? How do they need that data served up? And what tools can easily connect to that data set? Are they what the user actually can understand and start to use? Like, where will the data be used? In the wider business are the similar use cases that those data architects and gurus can start linking together, because they're really the people who will start to know your data to begin with and will grow massively from there. The data experts also need to kind of support that free time as well, because it's really difficult starting this on your own. Yes, there's more younger people who are joining organizations who get trained a little bit more on this, but they need support with that business context, which systems to use. And that's really where those architects need to dive in a little bit further. But what happens after you just know that data? What comes next from that? And for me, it's then unshackling that data. Just knowing about it as an organization and kind of structuring it in a great way is wonderful, but it's that kind of trapping that we're worried about what happens with data. Again, the media drives quite a lot of that, and we should absolutely highlight all of the great use cases of data, as well as some of the cutbacks, but those great use of the data often get wrapped up in just corporate successes like Netflix, like Amazon. It doesn't ever get spoken around as what did data really enable people to do? And how did they get there? Was it just databases were actually opened up to users, which we saw with some of the rise of Netflix and some of the algorithms that were used? But it's those messages that don't get shouted about very much. Often there's been a kind of level of exclusivity with data. So it's only those who can actually code in SQL actually get to really go and access it. The right tools aren't there, for example. Business experts who do work with data and start to know that data often too quickly get frustrated and actually move on, so that data knowledge just dissipates and gets rapidly lost. Also, what other data can we unshackle? Sometimes it's not always possible to open up every corporate data source, and I fully understand why. But sometimes making publicly available data open for users can be super, super powerful. And actually, that's one piece that we really enabled within Barclays, was to get people playing with more demographic information from the census. So they could start to understand more about their customers and the populations around them in their branches without actually having to give away any secret information and anything that could really compromise. We just structured a data set that was publicly available. And I do want to kind of go back to that theory of the, well, why not give a data set rather than the why? I do feel like corporate risk teams, ultimately their aim is to reduce risk, but it also needs to be to empower the businesses further. The organizations that I see do this really well get that pragmatic approach. That actually, if we ask why we can't give something out rather than why we can, and why we need to, it works really well and opens up that innovation quite nicely.
So yeah, as a follow-up to that, one of the things that happened to me when I was at Coca-Cola was that, we were supposed to do all of this analysis on our customers and deliveries and, sales throughput and all these sorts of things. And the data was available in the, in Teradata, so in the data mart or whatever you want to call it. But when I would go to IT to get access to the data, they would say, no, it's our data, you can't have access to it. Well, it's actually not their data, it's the company's data. So we would circumvent the system by running reports and then putting them into a SQL server that IT didn't know about. So are you seeing those same sorts of things in people where they just get so frustrated with not being able to answer their own questions, they just work around the IT department?
Every single day. And even my team back in Aviva, I probably shouldn't share this, but I will. It was that factor of, well, you can't have access to that data. When actually, if I went and asked another team, they were like, yeah, of course you can, because you're the business expert that understands this stuff. We're just collecting it. So sometimes that block is IT, sometimes it's just those teams around you who perceive your job as a certain thing, rather than what you can actually do with it. And I often blame a centralized IT function for this. I think ultimately they're being tasked with collecting the data, that then they're overly cautious on the use of that. And because they've lost the context in which that data was collected and why, the answer just becomes no rather than maybe yes, and what we can do with this. Your example at Coke there is not that dissimilar to what I've seen elsewhere, that actually people will find the workarounds to do this stuff. We're just burning money as organizations to actually go and facilitate that amount of effort and pain. And also, how frustrated were you as an employee by having to do that, rather than IT just going, oh yeah, connect to it, take care with it, and if there's problems, we're going to have chat about this, that we can only use up so much database capacity to actually run this stuff. And that was one thing that we got really lucky with at Barclays. We gave IT heart attacks when we were first asking to connect Tableau to our internal Teradata system. It was already overstressed. So rather than having a couple of hundred people who could actually code SQL to go and query that, we were basically saying, well, what's 5 or 10,000 people going to do to that? And IT's answer was the obvious kind of logical one, which was, let's shut it down. It can't do it. So we convinced the why not rather than the why. And we got the guys to actually measure using some Tableau dashboards, just for pure irony's sake, around the actual quality of the queries that were being run. And actually the stuff that was being run in Tableau was better than what I was coding within SQL. Actually, many other people apart from the people who built the original tables in IT, which was super exciting to see. So it became the why not, led to actually a huge amount of empowerment and unshackling that data.
So well, somebody left a comment, but it has a question at the end, kind of referring to the use of the word dark all the time. And now we're talking about dark data. Does anyone ask themselves why this is happening, or are we all just sheep? I assume that means just sheep following the herd.
Yeah, it's that wonderful, lovely term. And I kind of started to wonder whether this was just going to be another big data, or what people are just using the latest buzzwords. But I like the concept of dark, because it's not that it's necessarily evil, but it means that people are often wary of it. And I think it's kind of it has a little sinister edge to it, which is what I think lots of people feel about data in the first place. Again, back to my earlier points around marketing. I don't think it's necessarily people are being sheep or kind of being goaded in a certain way. But I think sometimes by actually just attaching a term to something, whatever that may be, if that creates a discussion around what do we actually mean by that and actually how useful that is, that would be way better than actually having this data just languishing in the bottom of databases with people either being blocked from the access to this stuff or actually really being able to ever get hold of it and start trying to prove what could be beneficial to it. Maybe we then call that light data, but that sounds a horrendous term.
Well, I think there's two sides to it. There's some people that are afraid of the data, like you said, because they don't want to know what's in the data. And there's other people that are like, oh my gosh, we've got all this data. I wonder what it could tell us to help us drive the business, right? So I guess it depends on the mentality or the philosophy of the management team at that company. Is data a tool, or is it a way to hide stuff?
Yeah, it's how afraid are you around what could potentially come out of this unknown resource. It's interesting you mentioned management again, because I think it really is an ethos that's set at the top. That if you really want to understand what's going on within your business, your organization, you can't do that just by talking to people, because we inevitably know that as soon as an organization gets over 10 people, politics ensues and everything else, and there's self-interest there. So really we need to go back and get as unbiased view as possible. Let's handle bias in data another time. That's a wholly different, probably few hours of WebExes and calls and talks. But let's try and get back to an unbiased view of data as possible. And the only way that we truly get to that is by stopping that data being this big, amorphous, massive stuff and letting people kind of go at it and seeing what benefit was there. Some of the dark data we had at Barclays, where we made a massive amount of progress, was as we brought in Barclays mobile banking, so the banking apps on your phone, that massively changed how people started to interact with us as an organization, which was great because it meant that we had more interactions. People weren't forced to go into branches continually. But what we could do by looking at some of the data that was loaded into the system, which we didn't really know what some of the codes meant, was actually there was enough data there to kind of warrant let's go and see what this is actually showing. And it was actually all of the individual clicks that were happening within the data or on the actual app. So we were seeing what people were interacting with, what they were finding useful, but also where they were hitting roadblocks. So that massively changed how we developed the app and what we could actually release on a timescale, rather than kind of being trapped into, let's go and do some traditional market research, etc. We actually got to see kind of how people were using our toy in the wild to make sure that we actually got the idea through of how we could improve it and what we could change. So we got that from our 3 million users, rather than 30 people in an artificial room knowing that they're being watched how they use the app. That's entirely different.
Okay.
Cool. All right. So that was number 2. Number 3 is the big one for me, and actually why I've left jobs before, because I haven't had those easy to use tools. As I mentioned, I'm a history and politics student. I did not get brought up coding, which is ironic because that's all my dad did for a job. So it was only when I was 26, when I finally mentioned that I was learning SQL to him, when he looked at me strangely, he was like, well, why didn't you ask me to teach you? So that was far too late at that point. The career had started and the history and politics degree had happened. So I kind of was already on the back foot with that. But even back then, and we're only talking less than 10 years ago, thankfully, that you kind of needed to be able to code in a language to actually be able to understand what was going on in this space, to go and get access to some of that raw data, to go and demystify some of what was actually out there. So that accessibility is a major piece. Yes, we need to unshackle the data, but just by unshackling the data doesn't help if we still have this kind of barrier in place that is the tools that we use to interact with it. We had Teradata at Barclays, and it was only through SQL coding that I got stuck into this. So do the tools actually really block new users? And I think that'd be a really interesting audit to kind of look around your data estates that are around you. Do you know the tools? Are you comfortable using those tools to go and interact with this? Possibly yes, you're listening to a kind of a data talk, so it probably shows that you're more of the data persuasion. But for new users in your organizations, do they have tools that are easy to kind of pick up and start asking questions? I think the rise of natural language processing and kind of being able to type that free-form search query that we've been able to do in Google now for years into data tools that will then go and search the database for us and bring back a visual that will show us going on will be a massive step forward with this. But it's not just those initial kind of new users, it's then how easy is the evolution from that to go and ask harder and harder questions. But really when I'm talking about new users, we know we're not talking about those central reporting teams anymore, those central IT teams. It really comes down to that decentralization. So can everybody in your organization have access to the tools that make sense for them, that allow them to dig in and work their way through? Reducing those coding barriers makes a huge difference. Obviously, Andy and I focus on Tableau and Alteryx, which are drag and drop tools, and we love doing that for a reason. It's not because they're easier to teach to our cohorts, it's because it's how easy it is for our cohorts to then go and support hundreds, if not thousands of people throughout their years that they have with us, working with our organizations that we partner up with to go and show what's really possible. And really, it's an easier way in for everybody if we kind of reduce those barriers. So actually, the investment in tools is actually more important for me when we talk about project funding, etc. Data, building data sets and structuring them, absolutely. But actually, if we really put the money that we're investing into data, centrally at the moment, into investing in those tools to actually empower your employees, you're going to see way more benefit than just the cost of that project. Because it's those unintended benefits and the innovation that comes from this stuff when we free ourselves up fundamentally, that's the really powerful benefits that we can get from this.
Also, so how do you then go about, or what would you recommend, how people should go about picking a tool? Because you don't want to pick a tool because everybody else is using it because it might not fit your organization. So what is the approach that you think companies should use for determining what the best, again, we do want easy to use, but there's a give and take as well, because you don't want to force something on people because then they won't use it.
Absolutely. I think for years, the way tools have been chosen have been by a central procurement or technology team who will go out, write this kind of tender RFP to kind of say, well, can your tool do this, 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 this? And a long list that is relatively meaningless to most common users if we're talking about self-service, which we are here. What do we really need those tools to be able to do? People need to be able to access the data sets that they have available, work with them to find that insight, to Andy's point earlier, or use their intelligence, to my point earlier, to go and find those nuggets that will help them improve their organization and their roles. So really it's, instead of writing this long RFP, can we actually go out and assess the tools by putting them in the hands of their users and just seeing how they get on with them? You know, is it just going and finding a range of employees?
Like almost like a POC. So, you know, I go to Carl because he's one of the analysts and say, hey, we're evaluating this new tool. Can you try it out for a couple of weeks and give us your opinion? Right.
Yeah, and it's the proof of concepts work really well, but it shouldn't just be Carl the analyst. It should also be Julie in accounts. It should be Dave who works on the reception, who still has to answer questions about the number of people that come in every day and how much staff does he need to do to man that reception desk to get it in the right way. It's, you know, it's everybody within the organization needs to be able to touch data. That's what we're talking about, this self-service piece. So I think we've always focused on the tech teams and those near tech teams, like the business intelligence team I used to run at Aviva. But it's actually by opening everything else up to others that we actually go and really start to see some of the benefits of this and actually who those POCs should be aimed at. Because if it is Dave on the reception or Julie in accounts, then anybody can really use this if we can then go and take those tools far enough. And that's the final check that I would put in place there.
So there's a question from the audience here. So when you use Tableau to empower users, is it about giving them nice dashboards or giving them the ability to do their own drag and drop?
Oh, love that question.
I have my own opinion as well. So,
do you want to go first?
No, it's your webinar.
Okay. So I'm going to sit on the fence and get splinters at this point and say it's absolutely both. Because one piece that underlines all of this, I'll get to it. One piece that underlines all of this is ultimately it's all about cultural change. So I always talk about in training around winning hearts and minds. The mind is what we're talking about in terms of those insights. That using your intelligence to go and apply that to the data. But who wants to do that and why if you're kind of skeptical about this thing called data in the first place? Well, actually, if you win somebody's heart, then you can actually get a long way there. It's why I don't often show business examples when I teach. I show things around basketball data that I've done, or cycling, or things about consumer spend, or something that will grab somebody's attention and actually win their heart first of all. So those kind of nice dashboards, just nice analytics in general, meaningful analytics, is actually really powerful. Having the ability to then go, but actually you can go and create that kind of stuff and you can go and ask those questions. That's where that drag and drop comes really quickly after there. So I'd say just a little bit first, the nice dashboards for the person who asked the questions phrasing. I would say kind of good analytics, followed by that ability to have that drag and drop. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think from a value perspective, you can use any tool to do dashboards. Dashboards typically don't add value to your organization. What adds value is the ability to ask the next question and quickly analyze the data. So I would say it's definitely the latter if you're talking about the value you can get from the tools that you choose.
Cool.
Dashboards are just dashboards. They're static points in time. They typically don't answer the next question.
Depends how good you build your dashboard in the first place.
Yeah, you can put 50 filters on it, but that's not very valuable to people.
Or good interactivity through actions.
Yeah, possibly.
All right, we're about to come to blows here, folks. We're going to move on. Welcome to how the data school really works with Andy and Carl, trying to discuss this and trying to get to the bottom of it and never getting to the answer. So, as I mentioned, the data school, this is absolutely the next bit for me. And it kind of feeds on nicely from that comment. You've got to teach. No tool exists out there on the market that just inherently does this so beautifully that you don't even have to sit somebody down or put them at least in a 30-minute training session to work out how to do that drag and drop, to how to do that, to go and answer their own questions. Just there is nothing out there yet. When that happens, then I can't wait to see that, but it absolutely isn't there at the moment. You ultimately need to go and show why somebody needs to invest a bit of time in learning this, and then organizations have got to have that investment in place to go and facilitate that learning. And that often comes through teaching. It might be face-to-face, it might be web-based, it might be recordings, but ultimately it's having that teaching in place at the right time for people as they want it is absolutely huge. Because really, when we talk about self-service analytics, we're not just talking about the analyst. We're really talking about the other people that I mentioned in your organization earlier. It's about that self-service piece for everybody. I always get kind of just like a little bit stuck in the back of my throat when someone says to me as I'm going around and introducing myself as I run training sessions going, I'm this person, I'm not really a data person. And that just kind of takes the air out of my lungs a little bit. Because like, why? Like, surely everybody uses data these days. We all look at bank statements. We all look at data and numbers in the media to just go and form ideas and assessments of things. Everybody's doing that. Maybe somebody's not looking at that bank statement, and that creates a whole load of different issues that I used to have to deal with. But that's becoming less and less as the tools get better to enable us to do this. But really, we need to go and help self-service analytics on its way by facilitating the skills that we take to use it. You know, those skills, like anything, whether it's a sport, whether it's anything that you do for a hobby, whether it's knitting, you need to go and coach those skills. You need to go and learn them and develop them through practicing. If we're not giving people that free time to go and practice and the tools that enable them to go and do this stuff easily, then those skills aren't going to flourish. We're not going to see the benefits that come from self-service. And we just kind of run aground really quickly. I'm not saying everybody needs a huge amount of training. Going back to one of my talks that I did at a conference previously, it was around training, but go and find the right levels for everybody out there. And I'm not saying you have to have one homogeneous brush that you paint everybody with. It really is about allowing the right training to go to the right people. Have an introduction that's open to everybody. Let somebody use the tool off the back of that introduction, but then monitor their usage of that tool. Because that way you'll see where you've sparked a fire and you actually need to go and facilitate that person going and learning and developing and building on those skills and taking it even further. You know, first of all, let's go and teach data literacy. It's the phrase that's out there a lot more. Doesn't include the word dark. Maybe if it's dark data literacy, then we'd have more focus on it than we do already. But data literacy, actually just reading and interpreting numbers. I mentioned my mum having kind of her pack of reports that she used to have to interpret within the branch. I actually got to go and look at the more modern version of that, which was thankfully becoming a little bit more electronic, but it still had moments of being paper-based. And I was in a branch in Clapham with somebody, and I was like, "Oh, tell me about the reporting and what do you find useful?" And the first thing she said was, "Oh, this chart's amazing." And she pointed to a box and whisker chart. I'm like, "Oh, interesting." There's not many people who would say that. She's like, "Oh, why is that?" I'm like, well, often people don't understand what it means. What do you think this one means? So I'm not sure, but it looks cool. I've seen a few of these in the media before, in newspapers, and it's kind of cool that Barclays are doing this. But then for that moment, again, it kind of took my air out of my lungs a little bit. It's all right, attractive, winning that heart of, this is really good, but if you don't win the mind and actually enable somebody to understand it, then it's harder. So we need to build that capability in organizations to be data literate. Then it's enabling those basic edits and builds to happen on existing reports, or somebody to go and take the idea of what they're seeing in that dashboard and go and ask that next question, and then go and solve it themselves, then go and ask another question because they're intelligent, so they will do. And then very quickly we get to the space where people are building their own analytics from scratch. We don't have to add it into project budgets anymore because people want to go and ask those questions. Yes, we'll need to build the time component in, but it's not this kind of centralized cost where we shove off the reporting into a different team to get it done and hopefully delivered by the time the project goes live. Or what ultimately happens with most BI projects, because they're seen as a cost, they get descoped, and that's one of the first things that goes. But one of my final points about training is, it's one of my favorite phrases, which ultimately my now boss, Tom Brown, used, which was when somebody fearfully said about training once, well, what if I train them and they leave? And his quick response was, well, what if you don't train them and they stay? That stayed with me for a very long time, and it's something I truly believe in, that ultimately we all need to invest in this. If every organization does, then we make this world a better place because we're able to ask and answer questions in a more innovative way, and that's ultimately how we can improve stuff. So, conscious of time, fifth and final point. This is where I kind of twist away from just talking about data to really what I think the answer in this space is, and it's visual analytics. Like everything that was spoken around about know your data, unshackling data, find easy to use tools, and actually ultimately teaching something, but making it really accessible really quickly, is ultimately stemming down to visual analytics for me. When I first got to present to the Aviva board, I managed to get a tree map in the presentation. It was built on a tool that was built by a couple of computer science grads who were working with me that summer, because I wasn't allowed to use Tableau or other tools, sadly. And that the tree map went up on the screen. And actually, before I could even say anything, the board members got up, went to the screen, and started talking it through themselves. So I saw the power that actually visual analytics let people go and do this themselves. They don't have to necessarily make it all themselves, but it can be that starting point to go and start to unlock the power of data and also show that importance of data. So why the visual part? Yes, we're all kind of clear that analytics, insight, intelligence is a great way to go. But the visual part comes down to those kind of fundamental elements that our eyes are brilliant at spotting patterns. It's the former kind of, or the old adage of the tiger in the forest. We need to be able to spot that. So evolutionary wise, our brains have been able to do that.
I was wondering what the tiger was in the picture.
Yeah, it wasn't just a random placeholder photo that I forgot to replace. Andy was looking at me skeptically, so I knew I needed to get to that. So it's that kind of argument that we've evolved to be able to do this pattern recognition and know when we need to run the other way very quickly or light a fire or whatever that may be. But actually, that's really true now. I still love showing tables of data. I've worked in financial services for nearly a decade. And it's actually showing that table of data and people going, yeah, no, this is good, this is really useful. And then I'll just visualize that data slightly, whether it's a highlight table or something else, and I'll point a massive outlier out. It's like, so was that interesting? You didn't even see that, did you?
Right.
And you get them begrudgingly saying, no, fine, all right, make your charts, Carl. But it's a fun way to do it and to kind of start winning over those hearts a little bit and starting to show the value of what we can do. If we find those errors in data sets, then we lose that mistrust that we have within data that we mentioned earlier. We might find new insights as we start to work with data for the first time to actually really get to know it. That's so much easier with visual analytics than it is with anything else. So
one of the tricks that I've seen people use to sort of get companies moving toward visual analytics is to give them the table, but when you create the dashboards, give them the chart first and give them the option to switch to the table, because then it's actually worked. You've still fulfilled the requirement, but it requires them to take an extra step. And then they'll get used to looking at the charts first, because that's the first thing that comes up, but you've still satisfied the requirement. So I've seen that as an interesting technique for getting people to switch.
Sneakily belligerent.
Right.
That's
passive aggressive.
Yeah. My technique is have two charts at the top of the page and then have the table scrollable at the bottom.
But you have to scroll down to see it.
You have to scroll down to see it. And also you need to really click on those two charts and interact with those two charts to filter that table down to a level where you can actually then really make sense of the table, because otherwise you have to scroll it too much. Because sadly I did used to work on tables, as I'm sure you did, which were hundreds of thousands of rows, if not larger. So it's really, as soon as somebody asks for that table, we know that they're not going to find what they're going for. So having that little bit of belligerence is a great way to go. Absolutely. I think it's also that kind of sharing piece, that we're all great. We all get excited when we find that new insight, that new piece of intelligence. But actually the ability to share through something visual is actually really powerful. Don't know if anyone's ever tried to sit you down and talk you through a company's reports, financial reports. It's dull as anything and it's likely to lose you. We started to visualize that data within the treasury part of Barclays, and that started to get a lot more conversation going around what were we seeing and why were we seeing it and what was the company performance and what we could do about it. Because the insights we found, we were able to communicate back in a much more visual way, so it got a lot more engagement and saved us having to kind of talk through people on end before we actually got to our point. Ironic after me saying that after a 50-minute webinar. But visual analytics, in practice, we kind of need to be able to interact with software to do it meaningfully. That first tree map that I mentioned, we kind of formed the basics of that within Visio. So that was resizing those squares manually ourselves after doing the maths. That doesn't work. We haven't got time to do that. So we do need some tools that are very focused on visual analytics to do that. We don't always need to lead with the explanation, but we need to get there eventually. Letting people have tools to explore, those dashboards where you can go and answer 1, 2, or 3 levels down of those questions before you get somewhere is super useful. But ultimately, sharing those insights is what becomes hugely powerful. So if we can do that in a visual way, that would be super useful. So they are my 5 keys to self-service analytics. Know your data. Once you know it, go and unshackle that data. Use easy to use tools, because that way it just opens it up to more people. but still know that you need to do some teaching. Go and find those appropriate levels and know that the power of teaching will really make the difference here. But really, visual analytics is the thing that underpins all of this, because if you base everything on visual analytics, then you'll get a much better conversation.
That's fantastic, Carl. Really great advice there. So before we, I'm going to ask Carl a couple of questions here, but if you have any questions or comments, please leave them on the webinar, and we'd also appreciate your feedback. This is super valuable for us for determining, what kind of content you guys like to hear and whether these sorts of sessions are valuable to you. So I actually want to combine a couple of the topics there. So we've talked about easy to use tools in teaching. So the easy to use tools, right? I get that. You want to find things that are, well, I think it's more about finding the right tools for the users, the people that are actually doing the work, right? So what if those tools are difficult to teach, though? How would you handle a situation like that? Or the other way around? Well, I guess that's the harder of the situation, right? So let's say you find a tool that's perfect, right? It seems like the analysts like it and everything, but it's only made for those few people. And if you want self-service analytics, the thinking there is it needs to be kind of data for everybody, right? Or insights for everybody kind of thing. So how would you handle that then if the tool itself is difficult to teach or difficult for people to pick up?
Then I would say it's probably not the right tool. Because if you're still putting up that barrier of, well, actually it's only our analysts or it's only the people who can code in R who can actually use this thing, then ultimately you haven't got self-service analytics.
Right.
You've kind of gone back to having that centralized or that exclusive use of data that hopefully most organizations are trying to break past and get to that self-service point. So it's almost slightly oxymoronical there. I think you need to think about those users more generally across the organization. Maybe your analyst can have a separate tool, but only if that doesn't then completely break that access and it becomes that exclusive thing. Because that's actually how we've got into the mess that we're in at the moment a little bit when it comes to data, that these tools are so far away from the average Joe as such that we can't really go and empower the users that we need to.
So, and then going back to your know your data question there. So one of the things that I see that tends to hold up a lot of data projects or IT projects or whatever is the notion of the fictitious one source of truth, right? That doesn't exist in any organization. So that bogs down things. So one of the practices that we had when I was at Facebook was if you publish something, you own the data. If it's wrong, that's on you. Do you think that's too, at a company like Facebook, I can understand that because it's a very, high tech company and stuff, but in a typical organization, how would you go about that? I mean, I thought it was a fantastic idea, right? Empower the people, but then they own it.
Yeah.
Right. So I don't need to look over your shoulder and say, Carl, verify these metrics for me. It's on me to trust you that you've done it right.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that as a concept because it's not saying that you have to be the data expert. You have to be the person who can provide the context about what that data is showing.
It's like the domain knowledge and the
because that's really that decentralization that's really important when we talk about self-service. So I kind of think that that's a brilliant idea, and to not say that it has to be the IT person who can, or the person who has to then go and code to build the table. Just that person needs to be able to ask the team, hopefully use the tools as well if those right tools are in place, to be able to go and look at that data and go, yep, that's right, that's a reflection of what I'm seeing from the customer interaction that we're having or the products we're selling, to show that that is actual reality.
Yeah.
Rather than, yes, we have a data owner who sits remotely, they're a central team, they own this thing, but actually how do they know that that's a true reflection just because the data loads are happening every night?
So it's also kind of like the sniff test, right? Like you need to know enough about the data to know, okay, that number, that doesn't make sense in the context of the rest of these numbers, because I've seen it lots of times where somebody presents a number, you're like, there's absolutely no way that our profit can be 120%. Yes, that's just not how math works.
Yep.
And people report stuff like that all the time because they don't sense check their data. So how do you teach that kind of skill?
I don't think that is a skill to teach. I think it's a case of if you empower people to be able to do this themselves, then actually that's how they find those answers.
Yeah.
It's not trying to remove that context. So Pete, Lee, and I, who were AKA the data ninjas in Barclays, there were 3 of us empowering people with Tableau. But what we didn't try to do was pretend that we were the business experts. There are 140,000 other people who worked at Barclays, a huge number. There's no way I can know their jobs better than them. They ultimately, to your point, have to do the sniff test themselves. So it's a case of how could we deploy the tools to them to enable them to do the sniff test, and then tell us if they needed changes, if they needed extra support to go and answer those things. So again, it's about empowerment of the people that will really help them.
Great. So again, if you have any questions, feel free to post them on the webinar. And we have two questions here. The first one I'm going to need to ask the person that left it to clarify. So the first question is, are CPEs provided for this presentation? I have no idea what that means. So if you could expand on that question and clarify it, that would be great. So the second one's a bit more intense. So let's see what you can make of this one. It's a good question. Are you seeing a rise in cataloging? Are you seeing a rise in cataloging to help unshackle data for business users so that data is distributed accurately and securely? What do you think? Well, let's answer that question first.
Yeah, I think this is really interesting because lots of organizations, as soon as they saw Wikipedia, they're like, this is the answer. This is why we need a Wikipedia for our data. I don't think you do. I think going back to your point earlier, Andy, I think you need to have that owner who isn't that central IT team that is just absorbing all of your data sets in your company. That you should have that ability to go and ask the person who can add the context to that data set to actually understand what that is. That business knowledge will change over time. So yes, it needs to be documented and held in some way, which is maybe where those kind of wiki ideas come in. But ultimately, you can't entrust and share all of the knowledge that you have in your head for that context, for that wider business knowledge into a wiki. Because if you do, you're probably still writing it 3.5 years later, and it's very redundant very quickly. Whereas the changing world that we live in, the pace that we work and live at now, you've kind of got to let your humans in your organization to kind of take some control of that.
Yeah. So maybe another way to phrase that question then is, at least maybe the way I'm interpreting this question is, you've got business users and let's say they're not that data savvy.
Yep.
How can you provide, pictures of the data or snapshots or, segments of the data that are most appropriate for them?
Yeah, I think that comes down to titling data really, really well. I think that's one thing that still happens is we give data horrendous field names because we don't really think about it.
Right.
Whereas actually if we start giving more human and easy to understand titles, then I think we remove quite a few of those barriers to actually let people go and work with the data. And again, it kind of comes back to the sniff test a little bit. There's only so far you can go, but if they're using their intelligence, they'll be able to use that data, see if it's sensible, and then go and start working with others. And also adding the visual element into that. There's nothing that I ever created where I published it without showing and talking it through with somebody else of, does it make sense that I'm saying this? Does it make sense that I've kind of done this?
Okay.
And I think that works really nicely.
Great. So I believe we've kind of answered the second part of that person's question. So one last question. This is from somebody named Carl. So I don't know if you planned this question for yourself or not, but maybe you did.
Maybe.
So a lot of times people are used to having all the data as well as the insight provided to them as they ask, how they ask for it, and therefore having to be taught something that they see as an analyst job is not proving easy. So how do you recommend working with those people in the business who perhaps see self-service as adding to their workload?
Oh, that's an amazing question. So I think the question boils down to, how do you stop people being lazy? Ultimately, it's showing the benefit.
They think they're really busy and they should. Yep. But, I mean, I guess maybe another way to ask the question is the time it takes them to go ask somebody else the question because they've already answered the question themselves.
Yes. And actually, the answer I always have to that is no when it's the first question they ask, yes when it's the 10th.
Yeah.
Because if you've got to train them how to do it for the first time, then actually the second time they'll start getting used to it and more and more and more and more and more. So it really, I was being a bit flippant with the laziness piece, but it's really around if you can show the benefit that somebody can actually go and answer that stuff themselves really quickly and be confident with the answer. You can only do that after you go through practice. But that's also about winning the heart and mind piece that I said earlier. If you win the heart, sounds like you haven't here, and that's where you're really battling. Try and show them the power of data in a different format. Maybe take it away from their exact day job show them what you can do with data, and then it's like, oh, but we could do that with our data, and then we might be able to see that from that. Okay, yeah, no, cool, let's run with that. And then very quickly you can actually get them to buy in with their heads, because you've actually gone and won their heart. It's a trick that I still use to this day, and so far I keep getting away with, to avoid that laziness of it's somebody else's job, I'm used to having this provided.
Yeah.
I'd also say, what's the quality of product that you're getting back? If you're getting back great reporting already, yes, that's going to be a lot harder. I haven't seen not much in the way of great products, so I don't think that they will buy into that much either.
And I guess another part of the self-service doesn't mean it has to look good either. The point of self-service is to be able to answer your own question with the data. Yes. But I think a lot of that boils down to the people that are asking the questions. So they might not be, it might not really be, I'm going to use the word data curious. They just want answers given to them, right?
Yep.
So I compare that to when I was at Facebook, and I was sent a message by one of the executives that said, hey, I want to start doing self-service, or I want to start doing my own analysis on my team or the products I'm managing or whatever it might be. Can you show me how to use this tool to do that? And that's a very different type of executive at, you know, of course, it's a very different type of company, but you compare that to, you know, any of the big banks around here, you're not going to see an executive go in there and say, hey, I want to start digging into my own data. They're used to being spoon-fed and having everybody at their beck and call. So how do you break that cycle?
That's starting to change. And this is the change of what's happening in the C-suite now. So those kind of the elite corporate leads, where
they're getting run out of companies because they're not data literate?
Yeah, because the CEO for years has always been an accountant. And they've been an accountant because ultimately what they have is the ability to understand the financial data information. That's just always been our accounts. Where that started to change to is I don't just need to know about the performance of my accounts and what's happening on my balance sheet, but actually what's happening in operations, what's driving the complaints, because that's driving the media that changes my idea around performance, etc. So actually the rise of the data analyst is going further than that, and actually starting
farther up the chain.
Farther up the chain, rather than the guys being stuck in the corner of the office. So actually, as they've come more to prominence in the organization, those execs are changing too. Yeah. It's not fully going to happen overnight, but as this proliferates through the organization, and I think we start to see that sea change of it's more expected that everybody will go and answer those questions.
Yeah.
Does it happen now? Absolutely not.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's, you know, once the farther, you know, every time that you ask somebody to go investigate a question for you, they're not doing the work that they were there for in the first place, right? The analytical work they were supposed to be doing. But okay, well that wraps it up. So thank you very much, Carl, for your time and the fantastic presentation. And if you could leave us some feedback and let us know how it went, and if you have any ideas for future topics, feel free to post those as well. And I guess with that, thank you, Carl, and we'll talk to you guys later.
Thanks, Andy. Thanks everyone for dialing in.